In 1942, at the height of India's struggle against its colonizers, a leading freedom fighter, Subhash Chandra Bose, called the BBC the Bluff and Bluster Corporation, bringing into question its status as a credible news broadcaster.
On the 3rd of January 1946 at 9 a.m, the last person in British history to be executed was hanged by the neck until dead. He was then buried in an unconsecrated grave. What was his crime? His crime was broadcasting, and the charge was high treason. William Joyce, between September 1939 and July of 1940, was charged with aiding and assisting the enemies of the king by broadcasting to the king's subjects propaganda on behalf of the king's enemies. He was judged to be such a powerful weapon of mass destruction that he was given the punishment reserved for the perpetrators of the most heinous war crimes, concentration camp guards, mass murderers, etc., execution. I'm afraid that I can't help but wonder, what if the BBC were to have similarly weaponized broadcasting to the level of it becoming a WMD, capable of directing the same devastation as William Joyce, but now in every language, to every home, in every country, in every corner of the world? The BBC is capable of manipulating the minds of billions. Like Joyce, it could be capable of making millions of people feel fear, feel hatred, inflict violence, and then potentially disappear without trace. Could its controllers resist the temptation to use such a weapon? Has the BBC been used in this manner to demoralise, to incite violence, and to destabilise whole societies? If it were to be used in this manner, I shudder to imagine the scale of the harm to global peace that it could inflict.
13 judges, 133 high-ranking civil servants, including diplomats, and 156 senior retired army officers dubbed the recent BBC documentary called India, the Modi Question as delusions of British Imperial resurrection. The letter says they would serve journalism better by running a series on the Bengal famine called UK, the Churchill Question.
Just like the establishment of other potent colonial tools, like the British East India Company in 1600, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, too was established under a royal charter issued by the British monarchy on the 1st of January 1927. Its purpose: to control and discipline what was then a poorly understood medium of mass communication. Fondly called the Beeb or Auntie, the BBC has been singularly responsible for shaping and moulding the mindset of the British public, as well as the unwashed masses dominated by Britain across the globe, right from Asia to the Middle East to Africa. The part of the empire that was supremely crucial to Britain, and hence the BBC's plans, has always been the crown jewel of the Raj, India. And why not? After all, from the 1st century to the 17th century, the period before the British arrived on its shores, India's GDP ranged between an incredible 25 to 35% of the world's total GDP, more than all of Europe combined. That is, till the British colonizers came along. An academic research study by renowned economist Utsa Patnaik, published in 2019 by Columbia Press, based on nearly 2 centuries of detailed data on taxes and trade, showed that Britain drained a total of nearly $45 trillion from India during the 173-year period from 1765 to 1938. For all we know, it was India's money that paid for the significant investments in technology and infrastructure that eventually became the BBC. As one delves deeper into historical annals, it becomes clear that beyond just concealing the looting, there was a far more important reason behind Britain's and the BBC's desperate interest in shaping the opinion of India's masses. The British Raj's war campaigns across the globe needed an endless supply of foot soldiers. Nowhere else in the world was there a readily available supply of tough, battle-hardened and disciplined men other than in the martial races of India. India's soldiers, with 800 years of experience of battling and defeating the Mughals and other Islamic invaders, themselves became the empire's own colonial army. Countless cases abound in British military history where an unthinkable victory under the toughest conditions was delivered purely on the back of the bravery displayed by Indian soldiers, fighting under the flag of their own colonial oppressors. Francis Yeats Brown, in his book Martial India, captures the enormous Indian contribution in World War II, writing, "India has 2 million volunteers fighting in the Allied cause. It is the largest, and I think the least publicized, army of volunteers ever gathered under any flag." The significance of this state of affairs was not lost on Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master Nazi propagandist. Goebbels tailored bombastic Nazi radio broadcasts to target the 2 million Indian soldiers in Europe, as well as the next batch of potential recruits in India. The prevailing anti-British sentiment was exploited to the hilt in these broadcasts. Early German victories were inflated and emphasized with an intention to damage the morale of the indispensable Indian volunteers. The carpet-bombing approach of this German radio propaganda was crushing Britain's own propaganda efforts to hold on to their crown jewel of India. It forced a panicked BBC to immediately launch a dedicated broadcast of its own propaganda in both English and Hindustani. Curiously, the specialist they chose to run the Indian propaganda section was none other than a certain George Orwell, later of 1984 fame. This appointment was ironic given that Orwell's book Burmese Days, which was critical of the Raj, had been banned in India by the British government. Despite this, the BBC gave Orwell the task of writing broadcasts targeting Indian audiences. It seems that the policy of message manipulation by a writer of fiction trumped over actual news. Messages and narratives were tailored specifically for different audience groups, and the skill of the wordsmith mattered more than facts or Orwell's personal perspectives. At this time, the British desperately needed to overhaul their image from a global pirate to a generous benefactor of India. You see, by this time, British colonialism had killed over 100 million Indians in nearly 40 years. The statistic sounds unbelievably traumatic even 100 years later. For context, between 1880 and 1920, British colonial policies in India claimed more lives than all the famines in the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea combined. Along with other staffers, the BBC enrolled Orwell onto a special training course meant to teach the finer nuances of the art of radio propaganda. The poet and literary critic William Empson, who was Orwell's coursemate and colleague, described the training course as the liar's school of the BBC. Orwell himself said, "One rapidly becomes propaganda-minded and develops a cunning one did not previously have." One might well ask whether it is safe to conclude that the BBC's standards and operating procedures were heavily influenced by the Nazis. Actually, the reality is slightly more complicated than that. Take Noel Francis Newsom, for instance, arguably the BBC's most controversial war broadcaster ever. As the director of European broadcasts, Newsom led what is still the biggest propaganda operation ever mounted in 25 different languages, broadcasting 24 hours a day across 3 wavelengths. It was Newsom who first implemented the strategy to use news as a weapon of war. For this strategy to be successful, content had to be perceived as not just true, but also recognisably British. Newsom and his deputy, Douglas Ritchie, presided over the famous V for Victory campaign, which was designed and deployed by the BBC to specifically foment a spirit of resistance in occupied Europe. A campaign so successful that even Joseph Goebbels tried to organise his own V campaign to subvert it. It was Newsom who weaponised the news to reinforce the idea of British imperial superiority, whilst at the same time creating the myth of a hallowed BBC. So successful was this strategy that it prompted Joseph Goebbels to warn the Nazis in 1944, "There is one way in which the British, despite the narrowness of their political thinking, are ahead of us. They know that news can be a weapon and are experts in its strategy." Years later, the carefully manicured projection of an avuncular Auntie Beeb based on culture, music and humour would be skillfully layered over this imperial strategy. But one might argue that all is fair in love and war, and since the world was immersed in the horrors of World War II with the Allies battling an evil nexus of the largest fascist forces ever assembled, should we be holding them to account? To find a definitive answer to this question, let us turn to John Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, and the person largely responsible for forging the institution as we know it today. His comprehensive and unambiguous diary and memoirs reveal much about the foundational principles of independence and impartiality at the BBC. A cabinet meeting, according to Reith's diary, took the view that the government should be able to say that they did not commandeer the BBC, but they know that they can trust us not to be really impartial. In other words, it was seen that there were advantages in retaining at least an appearance of an independent BBC. Just an appearance. A pretense, really. He further said, "The more experience gained, the more it will be realized that here is an instrument of almost incalculable importance in the social and political life of the community." Simply put, the corporation was always a colonizing tool for the masses at home and abroad, albeit with a catchy nickname and a benign-sounding paradigm. On 9th March 1933, Reith recorded in his diary, "I am pretty certain that the Nazis will clean things up and put Germany on the way to being a real power in Europe again. They are being ruthless and most determined." Now, this extraordinary, almost admiring excerpt from the personal diary of the founding director of the BBC suggests that he harboured pro-fascist, pro-Nazi views. A year later, in July 1934, following the Night of the Long Knives, in which the Nazis ruthlessly exterminated their internal dissidents, Reith wrote, "I really admire the way Hitler has cleaned up what looked like an incipient revolt. I really admire the drastic actions taken, which were obviously badly needed." And then 5 years later, after Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Nazis in 1939, he wrote, "Hitler continues his magnificent efficiency."